The first thing Walt Briggs said about May Sutton was that she wouldn't last the season, and he said it to three men at the feed store in Garnet on a Tuesday morning, and all three of them nodded in the way men nod when they believe something and have the comfort of company in believing it. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had worked cattle country for 30 years and had ideas about what the country required, and a woman alone on 120 acres with a herd she had never managed, and a property line that backed up against the Briggs land on its entire eastern edge was, in his assessment, a situation that was going to resolve itself before the first freeze. He told his hired man the same thing on the drive home from Garnet. He told his son when the boy came to visit in September. He said it often enough and with enough certainty that it had the quality of a fact, and he believed it was a fact, and he was wrong. And the way he learned he was wrong is what this story is about. May Sutton had come to the Garnet Valley in August after the death of her uncle, who had left her the property because she was the only relation he had spoken to in 10 years, and because she had, twice, come to help him through difficult seasons when no one else had bothered. She was 36 years old, and she had spent most of those years doing practical work for other people's operations, cooking, bookkeeping, seasonal management, without ever having an operation of her own. She arrived with 2 bags and a working knowledge of cattle that was broader than anyone in Garnet would have guessed, because she had acquired it quietly and across many places, and had never had occasion to display it in a single location where it could be assessed. Walt Briggs saw her come into town the week she arrived, and he saw a woman in a practical dress with her hair pinned back and a list in her hand, and the particular economy of movement of someone who knows what she came for and intends to get it. He had tipped his hat. She had nodded. That was the first exchange. He was at his eastern fence line the following Thursday, checking the wire along the shared boundary, when he heard her working on her side. She was moving cattle from the near pasture to the far one, which was the right thing to do in August, and she was doing it efficiently, without the noise that betrayal of inexperience makes. He had stopped at the wire and looked through and watched. She had not looked up. She had not needed to. The cattle moved where she directed them with the calm cooperation of animals who are being handled correctly. And when the last one was through, she latched the gate and turned and saw him at the fence and held his gaze for a moment, and then went back to what she was doing. He went back to his wire. He did not revise his assessment that day, but he filed the morning away in the part of him that was more honest than his opinions. The first weeks were the kind Walt Briggs watched without meaning to. He was at his eastern fence more often than he had been in previous seasons, which he told himself was because the line needed attention, which was partly true. He told himself other things as well, with varying levels of accuracy. What he observed was this: she was up before the light on days when weather was coming, which meant she was reading the sky the way a person reads it after long practice. She had repaired the south-facing gate on her property inside the first 10 days, which had been hanging wrong since he had known the place. She ran her cattle on a rotation that made sense for the pasture condition, and she adjusted the rotation twice before October when the condition changed, which meant she was looking at the grass the way grass needs to be looked at, rather than simply following a calendar. He observed the quality of her fence work, which was even and set at the right depth for the soil, and did not have the look of someone who had learned fence work from a book. He observed that she worked hard without making a performance of working hard, which is a different and rarer thing. He observed that when she came to the feed store in Garnet, she knew what she needed, and said so without elaboration, and the merchant dealt with her the way he dealt with people who know what they are talking about, which is to say, straightforwardly, and without the slight patient tone he reserved for people he had decided needed managing. He observed all of this. He said nothing to the three men at the feed store about what he was observing, which was its own kind of revision, and a slow one, and one he had not yet finished making. The first time he spoke to her, more than was required by proximity, occurred on a Thursday in late September, when her north fence had a section down and two of her cattle were on his land. He found them at first light, two of her Angus at his water tank, and he put them in his near pen and rode to her fence line and found the break, a post that had heaved in the wet soil, and he fixed it with materials from his saddlebag, which he had as a rancher, because a rancher in fence country always has materials in the saddlebag. He was back at his line when she came over the hill at a trot. She looked at the pen where her cattle were, and she looked at the fence, and she looked at him. She said, "I didn't know it was down." He said he had found it at first light. She said she would have checked it herself. He said it was fixed now. She looked at the repair. She looked at him. She said, "What do I owe you?" He said 2 fence posts, if she had any to spare, because he had used 2 of his. She said she had posts, and she would bring them. She brought them that afternoon, our 2 sound posts loaded in the back of the truck, and she unloaded them herself and set them at the post he indicated and shook his hand and drove back to her property. He stood by the posts and looked after the truck. He had the handshake in his palm still, which was a firm handshake, the handshake of someone who does not soften a thing to make it easier to receive. He thought about the feed store conversation, and about the word season, and about what he meant when he used it, and he did not like everything he found. He thought about the 3 men nodding. He thought about the kind of certainty he had delivered that morning at the counter, the easiness of it, the way no one had asked him a question that might have introduced doubt into the assessment. He thought about the fact that he had assessed her before he had seen her work, which was the kind of error a man could make once in his youth and be excused for, and which landed differently when a man was 51 and should have known better. He went inside and made supper, and said nothing further to anyone, which was the beginning of a longer process of saying nothing that cost him something each time he chose it. Not because the saying would have required courage he lacked, but because some corrections have to be made in private before they can be made in public, and he had not yet made the private one fully enough to start on the rest. October came in hard and early, with the kind of cold that got into the ground before the ground was ready for it, and the valley contracted the way it does when winter decides to announce itself before its time. Walt was at his eastern fence line on the second cold Tuesday of the month, which was genuinely fence work this time, when he saw smoke from her chimney going straight up in the still air. He stopped and looked at it. He had been looking at the Sutton chimney for 2 months, and the smoke had always been there when the morning was cold and gone by noon and back by supper, which was the smoke pattern of a house properly managed. He watched it a moment. Then he went back to the wire. The days had built something between them that neither of them had named. He knew she had seen him at the fence enough times that his presence there required no explanation, which meant she had already done him the courtesy of not requiring one. He knew her cattle were in good condition going into the cold season and that her hay stores were adequate. Because he had seen them, and because adequate hay stores are visible from a fence line to a man who knows what to look at. He knew that she had been right about what the rotation needed in September, and that the far pasture she had rested was showing it now, the grass coming back in a way that the previous tenant, her uncle, had not managed in his last several seasons. He knew all of this, and he had not revised the opinion he had delivered at the feed store officially, meaning he had not gone back to the counter and said what he now knew to be true. This was the thing that cost him something each morning at the wire, and he had not yet found a way to settle it that he was satisfied with. A woman named Helen Pratt came to see him on a Friday in October. She was a neighbor from the north side and the wife of a man who had opinions about property values and the kind of opinion holder who required her wife to transmit them. She sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and said she thought Walt ought to know there was talk, and that Walt was seen at the eastern fence line more than was usual, and that people were drawing conclusions, and that the Sutton woman's situation was one people were discussing in terms of what it meant for the valley's property values, and whether someone ought to have a conversation with her about realistic expectations. She said this with the warmth of organized concern. Walt looked at his coffee. He said he was at the fence because the fence needed work, which was true. Helen said, of course, and looked at him in the particular way of someone who has delivered what they came to deliver and considers the matter settled. Walt said he would think on what she had said. She left. He did not think on it in the way she meant. He thought on it in the way of a man who has been shown something he does not like about the thing he said at the feed store and the men who had nodded along. He thought about the fact that Helen's concern had arrived in the form of property values and realistic expectations, which were the same words that would have been used to describe any inconvenient presence in the valley, and that these words had been aimed at May the way they were always aimed, at women who were doing something the town had decided was impractical before it had watched them do it. He had said something at the feed store in August that had been taken up and passed around, and had grown in the passing, the way such things grow, until it was now Helen Pratt at his kitchen table talking about property values, and he could trace the line from his words to her visit without any effort at all. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after Helen Pratt had gone and looked at the wall, and then he got up and went back to the eastern fence line, not because the fence needed it, but because he had decided to stop pretending the fence was the reason, and because some things you can only correct by doing the opposite of what you did, and what he had done in August was stand at a counter with 3 men and render a verdict from a distance, and what he needed to do now was cross to the other side of the line and say so. She was at her side of the line when he got there, mending a section herself, working the wire with the practiced tension of someone who has done it before and has the hands to show for it. She looked up. He said He had been told people were talking about the fact that he was at this fence line often. She looked at the wire in her hands. She said she had heard something to that effect as well. He said he wanted to be straightforward about why he kept coming to the fence, and she looked up at him, and he said it was because he had been wrong about her, and he had been saying so to people before he knew it, and that he was not comfortable with either of those things, and had not known how to say so until now. She looked at him for a long moment. She went back to the wire. She said that was a more direct apology than she had been expecting. He said it was not exactly an apology. It was an account of where he had been wrong and what he intended to do about it. She looked up again. There was something in her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. She said that was a distinction worth making. She handed him the end of the wire to hold taut. He held it. They finished the fence section, and she said she had coffee on if he wanted it. He said he did. They walked to her house, which was the first time he had been inside it, and the kitchen had the ordered functionality of a room that is used hard and kept right, cast iron on the stove, and a ledger on the table, and a pair of work gloves on the chair by the door. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat across the table, and they talked. Not about the fence or the cattle or the property or the things they had not yet said. They talked about the valley and where she had worked before, and what she had seen of other operations in other places, and she talked the way she did everything, directly, without performing more than she felt, and he listened the way he had learned to listen at the fence line over 2 months, with the attention of someone who has decided to stop screening information through what he already believes. She had been a long time without a place of her own. She said this once plainly, not asking for anything about it, but setting it down in the room the way you set down something you have been carrying and have finally found a flat surface for. He asked how long. She said since she was 22, which was 14 years of working other people's land and other people's kitchens and other people's seasons. She said her uncle had been the one person in the family who had treated her work as what it was, rather than as something provisional, something she was doing until a different arrangement presented itself. She said he had left her the property because he knew she would run it right, and she said it without sentiment, but with the particular weight of a debt owed to a man who could no longer be paid. Walt looked at his coffee cup. He said he expected her uncle had been correct. She looked at him. He said it the way a man says something he is only now finishing the calculation on and means. He stayed 2 hours and left before the light was gone. And he walked back across the eastern fence line with the cold coming in off the ridge, and he stood in his own yard for a moment and looked back at the light in her kitchen window, and then went inside and made supper. The pivot of the whole season was a small thing, which is how pivots generally work. She had a young heifer that had gone down in the far pasture on a morning in November, not calving trouble, something in the leg that had turned wrong in the night, and she had come for him because the heifer needed 2 people to set right, and he was the nearest qualified person, and she had not hesitated to come, which told him something about what had changed between them. He went with her across the fence line and across her far pasture in the gray November morning, and they worked the heifer together for the better part of an hour. her reading the animal while he managed the leg, and when it was done, and the heifer was up and moving tentatively, but right, they stood in the far pasture with the cold around them, and the animal walking away through the frost-brown grass. She was watching the heifer. He was watching her. He said her uncle had left her a good piece of land. She said her uncle had known what he was leaving her. He looked at the pasture. He said he had been wrong about this land being too much for one person, and that he had been wrong about who she was before he knew who she was, and that he was not comfortable leaving those two things unsaid any longer. She looked at the heifer in the distance. She said she had figured he wasn't. He said he would like the chance to correct the record. She looked at him then, not quickly, not sideways, directly, and she held it the way she held everything, with full attention and without making it into more than it was or less than it was. He said, "I have the land next to yours." He said, "I have been at your fence line more times this fall than I can account for with fence work." He said, "I would like to keep coming if that's what you want, for reasons that have nothing to do with the fence. A breath. Permanently, if that's where it goes. As my wife, if you'd want that." He had his eyes on her, and he did not look away. She looked at the pasture, at the heifer moving in the distance, at the cold sky above the ridge. Then she looked at him. She said, "Yes, that's where I wanted to go." He let the breath out. The cold morning went on around them without ceremony. The heifer at the far end of the pasture, and the frost on the grass, and the ridge above them showing the first of the real November gray. And they walked back across the pasture together in the early quiet, not close enough to be conspicuous, and not far enough apart to be pretending. And when they reached the fence line, he held the wire for her, and she went through, and he followed, and they went to her kitchen, and she put coffee on, and he sat at the table. And that was where things were now, which was entirely different from where things had been in August, which was exactly what he deserved for what he had said at the feed store. They married in December. The three men at the feed store received the news with the particular adjustment of men who were wrong alongside someone, and had perhaps thought they would be less alone in being wrong. Walt said nothing to them about it. He had said enough at that counter in August, and had been paying the account down ever since, and did not see the need to add more. May came to the feed store the following Tuesday, for the first time, as his wife and the men at the counter were polite, which was the correct thing to be, and she received it as the correct thing without making more of it than it was. The eastern fence line between the two properties had been mostly left in place, because a working boundary between two operations has its uses, but there was a section near the shared gate that they had taken down in October, before anything had been settled, when the gate work had simply required it, and they had not put it back because the gate worked better without it, and the cattle knew their boundaries, and the fence could go back if it needed to, and it had not needed to. On a morning in the third spring, Walt came out to the eastern line to check the wire the way he had checked it since August of the first year, which was still often, and still for reasons that had never been entirely about the wire, and that both of them understood to be something else now, and had for a long time. The valley was coming green below them, and the creek at the south end of the property was running with the snowmelt, and the light at that hour was the particular thin gold light of early April that does not last, and that makes a person want to be outside in it for as long as it holds. He found May already there, working a section that had gone slack in the thaw. She had the tools she needed, and she did not require his help, but she moved over when he came to the fence, and he took the section beside her, and they worked the morning line together in the early light, the valley coming up green below them, and the ridge still carrying the last of the winter above, and the cattle in the far pasture moving through the new grass the way they moved when the season was finally and completely right. He looked at her working the wire. She had the wire tensioned correctly, and the splice was clean, and her hands worked with the same sureness they had shown over the fence line in September, and over the heifer in November, and over the 2 hours at the kitchen table in October, when she had answered his questions plainly and without performing humility she did not feel. He had said at the feed store in August that a woman couldn't run this ranch alone. She had proved him wrong before sundown on the first Thursday he had been at the fence watching, and every day after that, and she was doing it still. And the only change was that alone was no longer the word for what either of them was. And that was the story of May, who never asked anyone to believe in her and ran her 120 acres so well that the man who doubted her loudest ended up with the shortest distance left to cross. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.